They didn't need tanks in the streets, no gunfire echoed through the suburbs, no sirens screamed through the night. But make no mistake, something seismic, something dangerous is happening in America. It isn't loud, it isn't dramatic, but it's methodical, relentless, calculated. In the shadows of 2025, behind podiums and executive desks, behind campaign slogans and patriotic rhetoric, a quieter kind of coup is unfolding. It's not about seizing power, it's about redefining it, twisting it, concentrating it, burying the safeguards that once protected democracy under a mountain of executive orders, legal maneuvers, and cultural warfare. Donald J. Trump has returned, not as a mere politician, but as a symbol of a movement that no longer plays by the rules of the republic. This isn't the comeback of a political figure, it's the coronation of an ideology, sharpened by years of division, honed by resentment, and now unleashed with a vengeance. What we're witnessing is the weaponization of democracy itself, turned against its own citizens, its institutions, and its very ideals. Project 2025, purges of government departments, attacks on diversity programs, suppression of rights, and economic chaos masquerading as populism. This is not just another presidency. This is the reckoning. And in this deep dive exposé, we'll pull back the curtain on the darkest corners of Trump's 2025 America. Through policy, propaganda, and power plays, we'll uncover how a second term is being used not to lead the nation, but to remake it in his image. You won't see this on cable news, but you'll feel it. In your rights, in your freedoms, in the unease that something about America has fundamentally shifted. Let's go deeper. First, tariffs and trade wars. In campaign rallies and press briefings, Donald Trump painted a vision of American economic revival rooted in one word: protectionism. At the center of this strategy, a 10% blanket tariff on all imports, a sweeping policy designed to incentivize American manufacturing, protect domestic jobs, and punish what he often called unfair foreign competition. But beneath the populist appeal lies a much more volatile reality. The 2025 implementation of the tariff sparked immediate backlash across global markets. Key trade partners, including the European Union, China, and even neighboring allies like Canada and Mexico, responded with retaliatory tariffs on American goods. These weren't just symbolic strikes, they hit industries that formed the backbone of Trump's base agriculture, automotive manufacturing, and small-scale industrial exports. Soybean farmers in the Midwest began seeing export orders plummet. Tech companies warned of rising costs for essential components sourced abroad. Prices on consumer goods, everything from iPhones to washing machines, crept up quietly but steadily. Global figures like Sir Richard Branson publicly criticized the administration, warning that the unpredictable trade policies threatened to destabilize international business ecosystems. Multinational corporations expressed concern about long-term investment in U.S. markets due to the volatility and isolationist tone coming out of Washington. Even some traditionally conservative business lobbies like the U.S. Chamber of Commerce issued unusually sharp statements urging the White House to reconsider the one-size-fits-all tariff strategy. Critics suggest that the tariffs are not just about economic protection, they're a political weapon. By blaming foreign nations for America's economic woes, the administration diverts attention from internal policy failures and stokes nationalist sentiment. America First becomes less of a trade strategy and more of a cultural rallying cry. Internally, it also allows the administration to reward domestic allies and punish dissenting business interests, further consolidating power not just in Washington, but in the boardrooms and supply chains that power American life. Despite the administration's insistence that tariffs are cost-free, inflation data began telling a different story by mid-2025. Retailers were forced to pass increased import costs down to consumers. The average American family began feeling the strain at gas stations, grocery stores, and online checkout carts. For lower and middle-income families, the very demographic Trump claims to champion, these increases were particularly painful. Ultimately, the 2025 tariff war exemplifies the dark side of economic nationalism. It offers quick political wins and easy sound bites, but at the cost of long-term economic stability. It alienates allies, disrupts global markets, and burdens everyday Americans with costs they can't afford. And perhaps most troubling of all, it shifts the United States from a collaborative global leader to an isolated economic aggressor. Second, the immigration clampdown H-1B visa overhaul. In 2025, the Trump administration executed one of the most sweeping overhauls of legal immigration in recent memory, not with mass deportations or a wall expansion, but through a quieter, more technical strategy, targeting skilled immigrants via the H-1B visa program. The H-1B visa, often referred to as America's brain gain pipeline, has historically allowed U.S. companies to bring in high-skilled workers, especially in tech, healthcare, and research. It's the very program that helped companies like Google, Apple, and Tesla innovate, scale, and compete globally. Now that pipeline is under siege. In 2025, the administration imposed a new biometric requirement for H-1B applicants. While fingerprinting and facial recognition might sound like standard security measures, they were deliberately rolled out without sufficient infrastructure, causing months-long processing delays. This wasn't bureaucracy, it was sabotage by design. Silicon Valley was one of the first to sound the alarm. Major tech firms, long reliant on international talent, found themselves paralyzed. Engineering teams were understaffed. Innovation timelines were delayed. Foreign-born researchers began taking their patents and projects to friendlier shores: Canada, Germany, India. The message from the Trump administration was clear: if you're not born here, you don't belong here. What's striking is that this clampdown didn't stem from economic need. Unemployment in tech remained low, and demand for specialized talent continued to surge. This was ideological. Under the guise of protecting American jobs, the administration actively ignored the reality. There weren't enough Americans trained to fill these roles. Instead of investing in education or skill building, they choked the supply of expertise from abroad. It was xenophobia repackaged as patriotism. Behind the numbers are real people. Families split apart due to expiring visas. Skilled workers, many with advanced U.S. degrees, forced to leave the country they had called home for years. American children of immigrant parents now face uncertain futures, their lives held hostage by policy gamesmanship. Immigration law firms reported a staggering spike in psychological distress cases among clients, especially those caught in the limbo of delayed paperwork, threats of deportation, and arbitrary denials. Some corporations pushed back, quietly. Tech leaders like Sundar Pichai and Satya Nadella expressed disappointment in public statements, but largely stopped short of open defiance. Why? Because many feared regulatory retaliation. The administration had already shown a willingness to use the Justice Department and IRS as tools against dissenters. It wasn't just a policy shift, it was a power play. Economists warn that these restrictions may permanently damage America's global standing as the top destination for talent. Once seen as the land of opportunity, the U.S. is now viewed by many international professionals as hostile and unstable. In a world racing toward AI dominance, clean tech breakthroughs, and space exploration, America just told the brightest minds, "We don't need you." In early 2025, as Trump's administration tightened its grip on the federal government, one group quickly found itself in the crosshairs: the LGBTQ+ community. Emboldened by a conservative Supreme Court and a newly restructured Department of Justice, the administration began an aggressive rollback of hard-won LGBTQ+ protections, both overtly and through a wave of back-channel regulatory changes. These were not isolated policies. They were the result of years of groundwork by far-right legal groups and religious lobbying organizations. Now, with Trump's return, they had their moment. The aim was clear: to reverse the social progress of the past 2 decades and reassert a vision of America rooted in traditionalist, patriarchal values. One of the first targets was public education. The Trump administration expanded and federally incentivized a wave of "don't say gay" style laws, initially championed at the state level in places like Florida and Texas. Now, they reached across state lines. New Department of Education guidelines prohibited any mention of sexual orientation or gender identity in federally funded K-8 education. Schools that disobeyed risked losing funding. LGBTQ+ teachers were particularly vulnerable. The new guidelines created an environment where simply acknowledging one's identity could lead to job loss. This move aimed to silence and erase LGBTQ+ presence in educational spaces, further marginalizing an already vulnerable community. LGBTQ+ teachers faced unprecedented scrutiny. Several states passed bills requiring educators to disclose their pronouns and sexual orientation to parents, effectively outing them or forcing them into silence. Others were dismissed under morality clauses. The classroom became a battleground, not for education but for ideological conformity. Next came healthcare. In a swift and chilling move, the Trump administration reinterpreted Section 1557 of the Affordable Care Act to exclude gender identity and sexual orientation from anti-discrimination protections. Trans and non-binary individuals were now legally vulnerable to denial of care in hospitals, emergency rooms, and insurance coverage, especially in conservative-run states. Gender-affirming care for minors was banned nationwide in federally funded clinics, and multiple states moved to ban it entirely, even for adults. Some Republican governors began threatening to criminalize parents who sought such care for their children. This wasn't about safety, it was about control. In the Pentagon, Trump reversed the modest progress made during Biden's term. The transgender military ban returned, but broader this time. Any non-binary or gender non-conforming identity was now considered grounds for disqualification. Veterans who had transitioned while serving were denied benefits under new biological sex verification rules. Meanwhile, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, or EEOC, was quietly defunded and restructured. Guidance that once protected LGBTQ+ workers was withdrawn, replaced with language emphasizing religious liberty for employers, code for the right to discriminate without consequence. At the heart of this backlash was a coordinated cultural campaign, the revival of the traditional American family. Conservative media pushed a relentless stream of rhetoric framing LGBTQ+ people as threats to children, morality, and national identity. Books were banned, drag performances criminalized, queer art exhibits and pride events were surveilled or shuttered under vague public decency laws. In some states, police raids were authorized on LGBTQ+ community centers under suspicions of indecency and grooming. This wasn't lawmaking, it was cultural warfare. LGBTQ+ communities fought back, with protests, lawsuits, and a digital underground of mutual aid networks. But the cost was high. Hate crimes surged. Suicide hotline traffic among LGBTQ+ youth spiked. Transgender individuals reported record levels of housing and job insecurity. Progressive states like California, Illinois, and New York became sanctuaries, passing legislation to shield residents and visitors from federal enforcement. But even then, travel across state lines became risky for trans people, especially with Republican states coordinating on reciprocal enforcement agreements. America, once a symbol of queer liberation, was now a patchwork of freedom and fear. Internationally, the United States faced backlash. Human rights groups condemned the regression. European nations that once followed America's lead on inclusion began issuing travel advisories for queer citizens visiting the United States. The United Nations issued a statement of concern, but Washington ignored it. For the first time in decades, America was no longer seen as a beacon of LGBTQ+ rights. It was a cautionary tale. America first. In 2025, the Trump administration's foreign policy pivoted sharply from the multilateralism that defined past decades. The president's mantra was simple and uncompromising: America first, no exceptions. But what played well to domestic crowds came at a steep cost on the global stage. Alliances once considered rock solid began to crack. Treaties were torn up, commitments were walked back. The U.S. wasn't just redrawing the map, it was burning the bridges it had spent nearly a century building. Tensions with NATO allies reached new heights when Trump threatened to withhold military support from countries that didn't meet arbitrary defense spending targets, despite many already increasing budgets in past years. Behind closed doors, European diplomats described a trust vacuum. Privately, they began strategizing how to defend themselves without U.S. involvement, sparking quiet talks of a new EU-led defense pact independent of Washington. The message was unmistakable. Under Trump, America was no longer a reliable partner. As U.S. credibility waned, China and Russia stepped in to fill the void. Beijing expanded its Belt and Road Initiative across Africa and Southeast Asia without U.S. interference. Moscow brokered arms deals and trade agreements once reserved for Western allies. These powers didn't need to challenge America head-on, they just waited patiently as Trump did the damage for them, isolating the United States, alienating allies, and undermining its own influence. The administration pulled the United States out of multiple international agreements, including a newly formed Global Climate Accountability Pact and a Weapons Transparency Initiative. Trump mocked the United Nations as useless and suggested defunding it entirely. United States diplomats, once respected leaders of international law and human rights, were now perceived as erratic and combative. Longtime allies found themselves questioning whether America still stood for the principles it once championed: human rights, diplomacy, collective security. Following the 10% blanket import tariff, Trump lashed out at the World Trade Organization, calling it corrupt and anti-American. Trade partners responded with retaliatory tariffs, plunging the global economy into uncertainty. Germany, India, Japan, and even close allies like the UK expressed concern that the US had become unpredictable and self-serving. Many began pursuing parallel trade deals that deliberately excluded America, hedging against future disruption. Inside the State Department, morale plummeted. Career diplomats were purged in favor of loyalists with little experience. Key ambassadorships remained vacant for months, and diplomatic channels deteriorated due to infighting, confusion, and neglect. The hollowing out of America's diplomatic infrastructure wasn't a side effect, it was the plan. Fewer professionals meant fewer checks on presidential power, fewer dissenting voices, and a foreign policy dictated by impulse rather than strategy. By mid-2025, international polls showed a dramatic plunge in global confidence in U.S. leadership. Where once America inspired admiration, it now elicited fear, resentment, or worse, indifference. Global youth movements that once looked to the U.S. as a model for democracy, innovation, and rights began citing New Zealand, Canada, and even South Korea as more stable and humane alternatives. The most devastating impact wasn't in the headlines. It was in the slow, subtle decline of America's soft power. Hollywood still dazzled. Silicon Valley still innovated. But the moral authority that once backed the stars and code was now in question. In walking away from the world, Trump didn't just weaken America's alliances, he redefined its global identity. And the world, watching closely, began to move on. America stands at a crossroads. Its institutions battered, its values tested, and its people divided like never before. What began as a political movement has evolved into something far more dangerous, a cult of personality with the power to reshape democracy from within. Donald Trump's second term wasn't just a sequel, it was a revolution against the very framework of American governance. And while some cheered as traditions crumbled and opponents were silenced, others watched in horror as the foundations of freedom cracked beneath their feet. This isn't just about Trump, it's about what America allowed itself to become under his shadow. It's about the weaponization of truth, the suppression of dissent, the targeting of vulnerable communities, and the normalization of authoritarian impulses in a country that once prided itself on liberty. So the question isn't, how did this happen? It's what will we do now? Because history doesn't only remember tyrants, it remembers the people who stood by and the ones who stood up. And in this moment, as the storm clouds gather once more, the fight for the soul of America is far from over.